Tonight, full-scale invasion. The Russian military incursion of Ukraine is officially underway. Military and civilian casualties, deaths, and explosions across the country.
Plus, the threat from cyber attacks, the FBI warning over ransomware attacks to the U.S., and Exodus.
Israel was created to be a safe haven for the Jewish people.
Fleeing Ukrainian Jews arrive in Israel.
And the fight and prayer for Ukraine. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Global rebuke with echoes of condemnation around the world over Russia's military takeover of Ukraine. Welcome to Faith Nation in Washington, D.C. I'm John Jessup.
And good evening, I'm Jenna Browder. Russia launching an all-out invasion of Ukraine, land, air, and sea. And tonight, new sanctions from the United States in response.
The president calling the sanctions, or the mother of all sanctions, severe. But will they deter Russian President Vladimir Putin?
That is the question. On the ground in Ukraine, it appears U.S. intelligence got it right. The worst-case scenario unfolding nearly precisely as they had been warning.
CBN News national security correspondent Caitlin Burke has tonight's top story and joins us now with the latest. Caitlin.
Well, John and Jenna, President Biden says it's going to be a cold day for Ukraine. The U.S. and its allies announcing plans to move forward with what's being referred to as devastating sanctions, unlike anything ever seen before.
Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It'll strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It'll degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It'll hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions.
On the list of new economic actions being taken against Russia, sanctions that will target Russian elites, major banks, and impose export controls. Biden admitted sanctions take time to take effect, but he said the U.S. and its allies are united in their resolve to enforce them.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Biden stressed that U.S. forces will not engage in combat with Russia in Ukraine. However, he did authorize the deployment of an additional 7,000 service members to Germany and says the U.S. will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. John and Jenna.
All right, Caitlin Burke, thank you very much. And joining us now from Lviv, Ukraine, CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas. George, more sanctions today from the United States. I'd like to get your thoughts first on these new sanctions and the president's speech today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jenna, the president said it right at the top. He said, in essence, there was no guarantee that imposing these sanctions were going to deter Vladimir Putin. The reality is that the Kremlin decided a very long time ago, last spring, that this was their objective. This was going to be the offensive. And when you look around the world at the pariahs of the world, be it the Kim Jong-uns or the Xi Jinpings or the Ayatollahs in Tehran, we've imposed sanctions, plethora of sanctions on these three regimes specifically, and look at where they are today. Their economies are booming. They continue to violate human rights across the board. They do all kinds of nefarious things, and yet we continue to sanction them to the hilt, and yet it doesn't make a difference. And in the calculation for Vladimir Putin, he cushioned himself. He spent the last 8 years, in essence, building his savings account for such a time as this.
That is for sure. They were definitely fortifying their resources. George, Putin said his goal is the demilitarization, and he used a chilling word here, the denazification of Ukraine. I know that you've been in Lviv for the past several days, long seen as a safe haven for people in other parts of the country to flee. George, what's the mood there now, and how are people bracing in what appears to be Putin's design for a complete takeover of Ukraine?
Yeah, perhaps Vladimir Putin forgot that the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, is Jewish. This whole idea of denazification, he believes that the revolution that happened 8 years ago, the removal of his puppet regime, of his puppet man, Viktor Yanukovych, was in essence a coup d'état by Nazis, and apparently they know who the instigators are, and that's the concern that our intelligence agencies have, is that they do have credible evidence that potentially once the country is completely overwhelmed, that the Russian intelligence will go after these characters. But reality is that on the streets here, they're scratching their head. They're saying, "What is this? This is a man who is mentally ill to have these sort of ideas." That Ukraine doesn't even exist as an independent sovereign nation is just ridiculous, and that is also what makes them very afraid.
Yeah, there's been a lot of analysis, people saying that, people who've watched Putin for a long time saying something in him has changed. His actions have really united the West against the Kremlin politically, diplomatically, and economically. George, are we in a new Cold War?
Perhaps, but I think it was very telling that the chief of the German army said today. He said, "The army that I have the privilege to lead is more or less stripped bare. The options that we can offer politicians to support the alliance are extremely limited." The reality is Vladimir Putin realized how much oil the rest of Europe sucks from him and gets and needs desperately. He knew that NATO would not respond to Ukraine in this position. So he took advantage of the weakness this entire global structure security alliance has provided him, and in the process he's has his sights set on taking over the entire country.
George, in the few seconds we have left, I know that this is not your first armed conflict, but I'm sure many of the people watching will want to know about your safety. Can you share your mindset? And I know you specifically last night were asking people to pray for as the first reports of shelling started.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that for 25 years working at CBN News, one of the things that I ask the Lord all the time is that if he sees it fit, that he would put me ahead of his wave, ahead of his move around the world. This is a different kind of warfare, and we appreciate your prayers, not just for me, but for the nation of Ukraine as well.
All right, CBN Senior International Correspondent George Thomas, thank you so much for your reporting, and stay safe.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Well, tonight the FBI is warning of cyber attacks on government and private entities here in the United States. And today the president said the U.S. is ready to respond.
If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden their cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well.
Nearly a year after a Russia-based ransomware attack on the largest fuel pipeline in the U.S., a top U.S. senator is warning Russia cyber attacks could trigger a much bigger war. Virginia Democrat Mark Warner telling Axios, quote, "Putin's been pretty clear that one of the first tools he would use to bring economic harm to NATO and America is cyber," adding that all the hypothetical conversations about what will constitute an act of war suddenly get very real.
For more now, we're joined by Mark Montgomery, Senior Director of Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. Mark, welcome. Americans, as you well know, are already seeing turmoil on the stock market, and they've been told to expect a surge in fuel prices as the United States slaps more sanctions on Russia. Mark, how likely is it that we could see another cyber attack on the homeland like the one we saw last year on the Colonial Pipeline?
Well, first, thank you for having me. And, you're exactly right to zero in on that issue. I think it's very likely that Russia, in response to U.S. sanctions, particularly if they're effective against their financial services and energy sectors, is going to attempt to impose cost on our financial services and energy sectors. And of course, they can't do that through their own sanctions. They don't have the allies to do that with them, and they don't have the leverage. they'll have to use malicious cyber activity. And as you pointed out, just about a year ago, they demonstrated some of their capability to do that with both ransomware and also with the SolarWinds attack.
Yeah. The co-chair of the Cybersecurity Caucus in Congress, Senator Mark Warner, who we just heard from, is warning of the threat of a possible spillover of a Russian cyber attack on Ukraine that then would infiltrate the U.S. and NATO countries. How possible is that, and could a major cyber attack lead to a much bigger war, as Warner was suggesting?
Senator Warner is correct. In 2017, when the Russians conducted the NotPetya attack against Ukraine, it spilled over into Europe. It took down Maersk, the shipping liner, Merck, pharmaceutical, Mondelez, a candy producer, and also FedEx's European subsidiary. So significant billions of dollars worth of damage kind of event. If Putin were to go after just European targets, Western European targets, the interconnectivity with the United States system is such that it's highly likely it would impact the United States as well. So we are not just vulnerable from attacks on the United States, we're vulnerable from attacks on our Western European allies as well.
Some extraordinary reporting today, Mark, from NBC News that President Biden had been presented with options for offensive cyber attacks against Russia, targeting power, internet, trains, and railroads. Mark, I'm so sorry. If that reporting is true, this would be unprecedented.
So I do think, there's three legs to the stool. One, you defend yourself. Two, you kind of work together, collaborate with allies and partners in the private sector to do a collective defense. And then three, you do maintain a cost imposition capability, and that's those offensive cyber tools. So we should have those tools. I think the president probably took the right step here in limiting himself to sanctions for this level. Now, whether those are the right sanctions or not, people can debate. But I think sanctions were the right response here. I think offensive cyber tools might have started an escalatory regime that we don't want to be in yet. Now, we should reserve the right to use them. And if we're attacked in our critical infrastructure, I fully expect us to use both cyber and non-cyber tools to respond to any Russian aggression.
All right, Mark Montgomery with FDD. Good to have you this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Coming up, this year's major gathering of conservatives kicks off in Orlando, Florida. We take you there with live reporting on the headliners. And welcome back. With Russia dominating the headlines, the former president is weighing in on the invasion of Ukraine and hailed the Russian ruler's moves as genius.
Putin's smart. I mean, he's taken over a country for $2 worth of sanctions. I'd say that's pretty smart. He's taking over a country, really a vast location, a great piece of land with a lot of people, and just walking right in. This would have never happened, ever in a million years would have never happened, and I know him very well.
Former President Trump adding in an interview with Fox News today that Putin's attack on Ukraine happened, quote, because of a rigged election in the United States.
Tonight, CPAC 2022 is kicking off for its 49th year. This year's Conservative Political Action Conference in Orlando, Florida, featuring a slate of major Republican voices, none more anticipated than the former president himself. Trump set to headline and sure to make headlines at the conference this weekend. And CBN News Chief Political Analyst David Brody is at CPAC, and he joins us now. David, I'd like to start just by getting your thoughts on the former president's comments, going as far as calling Putin a genius and then once again calling the 2020 election rigged.
Yeah, I mean, Jenna, look, this is what we've come to expect from Donald Trump, and he always upsets the apple cart. He always does something that you wouldn't traditionally do. And once again, here he is basically calling Putin a genius. But here's the truth of the matter. I don't know about Putin being a genius, but the United States has given him leverage to look like a genius. And I think that's kind of like the overall point. In other words, this idea that we were having net exports of oil and gas when Donald Trump was president, and now we are not, gives gives Putin the leverage to do what he's doing now into Ukraine. So, you know, there is an element of truth to it, but of course Trump always puts it the way Trump always puts it.
It is interesting, a matter of perspective. You have some people like Trump and others saying that he's a genius. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he's savvy, and then you have others questioning his mental stability. David, on CPAC, several notable Republicans are missing from this year's CPAC, namely former Vice President Mike Pence and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. Meanwhile, disgraced former Missouri Governor Eric Greitens is slated to appear. David, how much does the lineup reflect the changing face of the Republican Party?
Yeah, it's everything. And it's not just the panels, but as you said, John, the speakers on stage. I mean, this is not CPAC, it's Trump PAC. That's pretty much what this is. And as you mentioned, Mike Pence not on stage, Nikki Haley not on stage, Mitch McConnell, this just in, so to speak. I'm just kidding around, but he's not getting invited. Lindsey Graham is not getting invited. And, you know, I've covered CPAC, I don't know, since Reconstruction, or at least my body is telling me it feels like Reconstruction. And I must tell you that Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and all these were staples for years and years here at CPAC, and they were applauded in a very nice way here at CPAC, but they're not even making the stage. So everything has changed, and Donald Trump has no doubt changed everything. We'll see what those straw poll results look like on Saturday night. That'll be interesting to watch. We obviously know Donald Trump's going to win the straw poll, but we'll see how Ron DeSantis does, because he's probably going to come in second.
Yeah, that is always interesting to see. David, a head scratcher is presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard, Democratic Congresswoman, Tulsi Gabbard. She's there at CPAC scheduled to speak. Why her? Why would they invite her and maybe not some of these other more establishment Republicans?
Well, a couple of things are going on. Number one, many in the conservative movement believe that Tulsi Gabbard has had her red pill moment, or many red pill moments. In other words, kind of coming out of the dark and coming to the bright side. And I think that's a big part of it. She's been very critical of the Biden administration, so they like that. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what the applause will be, or lack thereof, from the CPAC crowd, because she is going to, in essence, say that, look, what Putin is doing, you know, is not necessarily that big of a deal. And what I mean by that is that she's going more down the appeasement route with Vladimir Putin. That is not a traditional Republican policy position or a position overall. So that is going to be interesting to watch. So I'm not even watching so much what Tulsi Gabbard says as much as what the audience reaction to Tulsi Gabbard will be.
David, we only have about 30 seconds left, so can you tell us a little bit about the mood that you're seeing there in Orlando?
Very joyful, very festive, a lot of smiles. There's a sense of anticipation here that there's going to be a red wave coming in 2022. I know we've talked about it on the air, but there's open talk here about the best times are ahead for the Republican Party. That's been the sense since I've been here.
All right, David Brody, live for us in Orlando, Florida at CPAC. Good to have you on this evening, David. Thank you.
Thanks, David. When we come back, Israel's helping hand, taking Ukrainian Jews out of the conflict zone and making the Jewish nation their new home. Well, welcome back. Israel has been urging Jews in Ukraine to leave the country for weeks.
And many of them are now making the Jewish nation their home. The most recent group arrived just a few days ago, as Chris Mitchell reports.
Nearly half of the passengers on this Ukrainian flight are immigrating to Israel.
We are very excited that you're here.
Minister of Aliyah and Integration Panina Tamano-Shata welcomed the newcomers.
Our message is very clear for the Jews of Ukraine. The state of Israel will always be open for them, for whoever chooses to come here, to embrace them, to accompany them.
Dozens of Ukrainian Jews on this flight are some of the regular arrivals sponsored by the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. Given the precarious situation in Ukraine, it's expected many more Ukrainian Jews will make their way here to Israel.
Israel was created to be a safe haven for the Jewish people.
The organization has helped Jews return to Israel for decades.
This is biblical prophecy coming to fruition. When you read the scriptures, how awesome is it that you don't only see it unfolding before your eyes, but that you're taking part in it. This is all possible, everything, all of these new immigrants coming off the plane in Israel, the fulfillment not only of their dream, but the dream of the prophets 2,500 years ago, is possible because Christians and Jews came together to bring them home.
Although not a rescue flight, the passengers are glad to be free from an uncertain situation.
We're scared because we don't know what happened, and we hope for our flight. We wait, and we waiting for our flight, and we're very happy that we are now in Israel.
3 generations of the Zelensky family made the trip.
We had a business in Donetsk. The first time they bombed all the businesses. Now we're afraid we'll lose everything again. Things are dangerous, and that's why we immigrated.
It's an unbelievable experience.
Reverend Johnny Moore, president of the Congress of Christian Leaders, says as a parent, he was happy to see freedom for these children.
I just put myself in their shoes, you know, the opportunity to be able to go someplace. And that's what the state of Israel is for the Jewish people all around the world. If they need to, should they choose to, whatever their reasons. And I'm so proud that the Christian community, for a full generation, has decided to take personal responsibility to bless the people of Israel in this very, very, very practical way.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Ben Gurion Airport, Tel Aviv.
Coming up, a solemn song and call to prayer from the streets of Ukraine. You're watching CBN's Faith Nation. Finally tonight, a solemn moment in the hours before Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukrainian citizens were preparing for war.
For some, that meant carrying weapons on the street. For others, like this young group of Ukrainians you're about to see, it meant singing a beautiful chorus. As the shelling started, CBN's George Thomas captured the voices of some brave young people singing about their beloved nation in downtown Lviv. The lyrics essentially say or translate to, "We will fight for freedom, we will die for our country." Many people are, of course, praying for God's intervention and wisdom and for protection over so many innocent lives during these tumultuous times.
Yeah, and we're certainly, our hearts and our prayers are with the Ukrainian people, and I have to say the resolve that they've shown has been inspiring.
Absolutely inspiring. Thanks so much for watching Faith Nation.
Have a great evening.